In the name of our extraordinary Creator God. Amen. A question. Have you ever experienced a paradigm shift? That feeling of knowing that your way of seeing the world, the way of relating perhaps to others or the world, has shifted quite dramatically. And there can be different catalysts or triggers that start us on that journey. It could be something like the birth of a child. It could be the death of a loved one. It could be an illness of some form, a remark that's made by somebody, maybe even a book or an article in a magazine that we read. Whilst those catalysts happen in every single one's life, whether we name them or not, there is a subtle differentiation, and that differentiation often comes up in our attitude towards us, because we either see it and engage in it as an evolutionary opportunity, or we actually just don't even acknowledge that they happen for whatever reason, and we're not willing to continue on that journey that is part of the ongoing creativity of God. And our resistance to that means that we're not adding into this dynamic that is always at work, which is part of God in our midst. Now, in some ways, that's part of what our gospel reading is in today's lesson in Luke. Because Jesus is both the embodiment of a cosmic shift and also the catalyst that is the invitation to everyone to become more of what it means to be fully human. And when Luke wrote that gospel, we're actually working with two time zones, in the sense that the incident that Luke is reporting happened when the temple was still a core part of the Jewish faith paradigm. However, we have that recording in one time zone when Luke himself was recording this story, which is a number of decades later. The temple no longer existed. It had already been destroyed, and people were really struggling to come to terms with that. So we have the God intention, which was the meaning behind the temple, which had become overlaid with human agendas and egos. Let's look at a little bit more of the historicity around that. So at the time of the story in Luke's Gospel, when the temple was still around, it had been, I suppose, beautified on an extravagant, almost beyond words, extravagant level, into great magnificence by King Herod. But King Herod did that not to glorify God, but entirely for his own self-glorification. So increasingly, people were coming to the temple not to worship God, which was the original intention, but actually as tourists, to see something which was a wonder of the world at the time. And then, as I say, when Luke was recording this gospel, the temple no longer existed, and the Jewish people felt lost. The question then rises for themselves, and Jesus implies this in the telling of the story, is who or what were they worshipping? Were they worshipping the temple, or were they worshipping God? Because if you worship God, you don't need the temple. So an interesting question, and it's a question that we are challenged with even in this day and age, and in many ways through all human eras that we lived in. Yes, we might not necessarily have a temple in the literal sense of the word, but in the figurative sense of the word, we all have those things that we hold on to, that we are resistant to some sort of transformation, whatever it is. It could be a paradigm, it can be a lifestyle, And those often need to be deconstructed in order to receive God's fresh, new invigoration of possibilities, new visions, new paradigms. And that works not only personally, but also communally and globally. And maybe this also takes us into our Isaiah reading. Because in Isaiah, we have this prophetic notion of a new heaven and a new earth. What we need to understand is that in the English translation, we've lost some of the meaning there. What apparently was the original and more accurate reading of those words is a new order of heaven and a new order of earth. And we need to look at what are we insisting, what are we holding on to in terms of an old order in the worldwide context of today. Let's make that simpler and more manageable on practical terms. Take, for example, just the weather. A simple thing. So we know there have been floods in the UK, floods in KZN, tornadoes. Let's look at even our more localized weather. Johannesburg, how many of us have said, gosh, this is strange. We know this area as having winds in August, rain in September, and this year it's been winds in October, rain in November. That's just a simple example. So yes, part of our language around that and part of how we're understanding that is this shift in weather patterns is something that we explain as a consequence of our human misbehavior, and we name it global warming. But maybe we need to add another question. Is that all? But is that all that's going on? What if, not the huge destruction thing, but what if part of the chaos is because God is reordering this earth? God always works creatively out of chaos in part of the reordering. And we need to ask ourselves, if this is part of the reordering, which many theologians believe it is this, are we in the midst of God in transition to a new norm? Or are we already on that beginning? Is it the early stages of the new norm? We've already transitioned. We don't know. And this is where discerning prayer needs to be involved in that way of coming to a realization of it. But what are we going to do then? Because we know that we don't have a clockmaker God. God hasn't created the whole universe and then kind of wound it up and left it to keep going. We know that that creative impetus is still on the go. So it's very valid that there's a new norm that is coming into that. And we have a choice of how we're going to engage with that. So we can fight against it, saying we don't want the reordering of the old story. We can insist that things go back to the way they were. I mean, I don't know how the insistence is actually going to work because we don't have the power to do that. We can treat any change as a problem that's got to be solved. Or we can start surrendering to this new story with those components that we recognize. Not all the components are, of course, but those components that we recognize that are part of God. And which, by the way, means that even we as a species will probably be reformed in this ever-evolving cosmic story. So in a very real and a very felt sense, yes, we are in a time of tremendous teetering transition as old categories, former worldviews and perceptions of this life and this distorted planet itself are being shattered, are being dissolved, are being reworked and reimagined by God. What is your impulse in the midst of this? What is my impulse in the midst of this? And maybe we need to just look at the difference between an impulse and a reaction. An impulse is very simply a more intuitive urge, a more intuitive desire, whereas a reaction is strongly emotive, it's defensive, it's often an unthought through response, a more immediate thing. Now, hopefully, our impulse is going to be that we will choose to partner ourselves with the divine impulse, which is always at work in our midst and beyond our knowing. Will we intentionally be part of the sacred impulse, because at its very heart is the energy of a creative impetus, and we are made in the image of God. We also have that creative impetus. James Conlon says that in this era now, we're invited to be two things at least. Not only, but at least two things. Hospice workers and midwives. Let's see what he means by that. So when he looks at hospice workers, what he's saying is that part of what we're needing to be is caringly attentive and bearing witness to dying institutions, dying cosmologies, and dying patterns of being, as well as being midwives, in the sense of midwives of a new story, fresh ways of being, and a new order being born in our midst. It is a stormy time. It's messy. As emotional upheaval abounds, we are going to find ourselves emotionally seesawing. And spiritual crises of all kinds explode and open up to new understandings. And global crises occur on all sorts of levels. Just think of the fires in Australia. Tragedy, doubt, annihilation they seem to be overshadowing just about every concern. But that is only a seeming. It's not the whole truth. Because it's precisely at these times of a loss of trust in former things. It's in these times of intensification of insecurity and uncertainty that there is this opportunity. It's an opportunity, most often, especially as Christians, to be reminded of God and God's faithful, loving, ongoing action in our lives. What's happening is not a definition of what God's intention is. God's intention is always resurrection and new life. Yes, things are dying, but life is continuing. And in the midst of all this chaotic cosmic paradigm shift, Brother David Steindl-Rast reminds us that eyes only see light, ears hear only sounds, but a listening heart perceives meaning and hope. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, we've looked at some of the things we can do, and we've seen it also in some of the Canticle of Hope. But maybe in this little closing précis, that is an extract of something that Ruben Alves has written, maybe we can do this proactively. And I do invite us to take the image of the date tree, not only literally, but figuratively. And this is what he says. Let us plant dates, even though those who plant them will never eat them. We must live by the love of what we will never see. This is the secret discipline. It is a refusal to let the creative act be dissolved away in immediate sense experience, and a stubborn commitment to the future of our grandchildren. Such disciplined love is what has given prophets, revolutionaries, and saints the courage to die for the future they envisaged. They make their own bodies the seed of their highest hope. Amen.